Coral reefs are actually found right across the globe, but they're restricted to an area around the equator. So we'll now talk about the factors, the environmental factors that limit reef formation outside of these main areas. In this world map, each of the orange-red dots are showing you the location of a coral reef. And you can see they're really restricted to an area within about 30 degrees south and north of the equator. If we look at the environmental conditions that occur within this particular region, we know that coral reefs actually grow in areas where there's relatively warm water. Unfortunately though, if water becomes too warm, this can lead to coral bleaching and mortality. In this map here, which is showing average annual sea surface temperature, we can see that around the equator, temperatures on average are around about 29.8 degrees. And in fact, we're seeing coral reefs restricted to an area where temperatures are usually above about 20 degrees. Coral reefs also grow in areas with bright sunlight, and we know that the intensity of light is brightest closest to the equator. This again is showing you a world map with a map of the intensity of sunlight across the globe. And again, it's showing average annual light intensity from that same database. Around the equator, we have about 50 Einsteins per meter squared per second, and this is just one way of measuring light intensity. So we know coral reefs really seem to be restricted to areas where there's bright sunlight. Reefs also tend to grow in areas where there's relatively low nutrient concentrations. And when we're talking about nutrients, we're mainly thinking about nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, which are really important for the growth of tissue biomass. Actually, reefs occur in areas where there are about 0.35 micromoles per litre of nitrogen. And again, that's just one unit for measuring the concentrations of chemicals in a solution. If we look down near Antarctica, we see much higher levels of nitrogen, around about 21 micromoles per litre. We see exactly the same pattern for phosphorus. At the equator, we have very low levels, whereas near Antarctica, we have levels much higher. And another thing we know is important for the formation of coral reefs is the salinity of the ocean. Reefs tend to occur in areas where salinity is around about 34 up to about 37 parts per thousand. We very rarely see reefs occurring in areas with low salinity. One of the reasons why we see coral reefs forming in areas where there's high light and usually warm temperature is that the calcification or the growth of the coral skeleton increases with both light and temperature. These plots here are showing you coral growth rate on the y-axis. So we have different ways of measuring coral growth, either through production of calcium carbonate skeleton or through extension of the coral colony over time. These are both just different ways of measuring the same thing, which is measuring coral growth. On the x-axis for these panels, we see annual sea surface temperature. And on this side, we have annual solar radiation or light intensity. In all of these cases, though, we see this linear relationship of increasing growth with increasing temperature. So as long as temperature remains within the range of about 23 to 28 degrees centigrade, we see this increase in growth with increasing temperature. The same thing with light intensity. As light intensity goes up, coral growth rate also increases. We need to keep in mind though, if we go much above this range, above about 31 degrees centigrade, under those very warm water conditions, we can see coral bleaching and coral death. So this relationship of increasing growth with increasing temperature and solar irradiation or light intensity is really restricted to a certain range of temperatures and light. If we go way above that, then we actually see damage to these corals and decreasing growth and even mortality. If we summarize all of this information together, we can see we have a range of limiting conditions that determine where coral reefs form. We need temperatures between about 18 and 32 degrees. We need relatively high light availability. we need low nutrient concentrations, and we need salinity within a range of about 32 to 37 parts per thousand. If we move outside of these ranges, we can still see growth of certain types of corals, but we don't see reefs forming outside of this range of conditions. So some special species, some special types of corals can actually be found growing at more than 80 meters depth where light availability is very limited. These include things like this Tubastria coral here on the left, and this Lophelia coral here, which actually forms structures that are similar to reefs at around 200 meters depth off the coast of Norway, where it's very cold and very dark. Some other environmental conditions are also important for determining where reefs occur. When water flow is too vigorous, that can actually prevent coral larvae from settling on the substratum and forming coral colonies. And it can also prevent corals from growing large, because when they get too big, the water motion simply knocks them over and breaks them off the reef substratum. So there's certain areas where there's too much wave action for coral reefs to form. This image here is of One Tree Island on the southern Great Barrier Reef, and you can see this really high wave energy on these outer reef crest areas. We'll talk about how wave energy impacts coral growth and how it might prevent certain coral species from occurring in certain habitats in our zonation section of this program.